He was like, that's not what I meant. And he was like, I think you could have just did one. And I was like, oh!
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to, thank you for that, Building Spiritual Structures, Biblical Principles to Support Students in the Classroom, in Advising, in Student Services, and in Administrative Settings. I appreciate you all being here this morning for the live presentation, and also for those of you who are watching this on the video recording. We appreciate you tuning in and watching that at your discretion also. To begin, I want to make a couple of disclaimers. It may seem like I'm stating the obvious, but I think it's important to do that, especially when with the topic that we're discussing today. And the first disclaimer is this. The content of this material, the presentation, is coming through the framework or the worldview of the Christian faith. So the guiding principles of Christianity, the moral value that's associated with that, that is what frames the content of our presentation today. So the Christian faith is our foundation, and that's the perspective that we're coming from, especially when I'm making reference to the Christian scriptures or biblical text, coming through that perspective. I recognize that the Christian faith is a very broad category, and there's a lot of variations within that. And so you may see some even further defining as we go through today, but the broad spectrum of Christianity is what will guide us. And then the second disclaimer is that as we talk about the content and get to the application piece, my intention is for it to be comprehensive. So I'm going to do my best to single out different roles that we all play, but I want to ask you to consider your role and how you can internalize and make application for yourself. I may not say it specifically, so I'm asking you to do that for yourself, especially when we get to the application portion of it. Because the content here I intend to be comprehensive. I intend for it to apply campus-wide. Whatever role you play here at BHCLR, I want this to assist you from your context. So with that, let me share with you the 4 objectives that I have for our presentation. The first is that at the conclusion of our session this morning, you will have some historical background of the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Secondly, that you will understand why those 2 books were written and the composition of those 2 books, why they're connected together. The third objective is that you will identify, or we will identify, 3 events that occur in the Ezra and Nehemiah books that have a spiritual significance for our own contemporary culture. And lastly, that we will be able to make relevant spiritual application of those 3 events and the principles of those 3 events to our own current academic context and culture. So those are our 4 objectives that we're going to address as we go through the presentation today. To begin, let's start with the historical background of Ezra and Nehemiah. So what I've put here on the screen is a layout of the Old Testament scriptures, the order in which they occur, and the broader categories that they fall under. This is important to have some foundation from a biblical perspective so that we can understand those 3 events that we're going to talk about from Ezra and Nehemiah. So the first section of the Old Testament is what's called the Law of Moses, and that's where the first 5 books are located. The Jewish faith refers to this as the Pentateuch. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books, and they are foundational in the Old Testament scriptures. Then the following 3 books record the history of God fulfilling His promise that He gave to the Israelites. And that promise was, I will give you a land flowing with milk and honey. And He does that in the books of Joshua and Judges, and to some degree in the book of Ruth. There's a little asterisk by that book because it's a little bit of a stretch to put her in this category, but I did anyway. The next section is the history of Israel during the period when they were ruled by an earthly king. And we find that history in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Essentially, it is the same history that is told 3 different times from 3 different perspectives and from 3 different writers. After that history, then we move into a period that's called the post-exilic writings, and what that means is the Israelites were exiled from their homeland. They were no longer living in the Jerusalem, the land that God had promised them, and that period lasted for many years, but then they were brought back, and after they were brought back, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther were written to give them direction for what to do now that they had been brought back into the promised land. And then after that, again, there's a little asterisk next to Esther. She's a little bit of a stretch, putting her in that category, but there is an argument to be made that the content of that book also supports the category of post-exilic writings. And then after that, you have the books of poetry, Job and Psalms, and then wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. The major prophets come after that, and then you have 12 minor prophets. And there is, when you look at the historical time period, there is overlap of what is being written here during this time period, or during this category, as well as during this category, with what's going on up here during the history and during the post-exilic writings. So these prophets were living during the time when this history was taking place. And these minor prophets, it's the same for both of those. So that's important to know that there is a little bit of overlap in some of those writings. Ezra and Nehemiah, we see, is right here under the post-exilic writings. And originally, these were not 2 different books. They were just one book. They were connected together and historically referred to as the Ezra-Nehemiah narrative. A narrative is essentially a story. It recounts history. And that's what Ezra and Nehemiah did. It recounts the events that occurred after the Israelites came back to Jerusalem. They had been in exile, and they came back to their homeland, and so Ezra, Nehemiah were 2 books written to recount what happened once they returned. And it's also called a post-exilic book, I told you just a moment ago, because it happened after they had been in exile. So there's a couple of periods in this early part of the Hebrew or Israelite history where they were in exile. You might remember what happened during this time period when the book of Exodus was written. That was the first time that they were freed. They had been in Egypt under Egyptian bondage, and God freed the people, and that's what led to Him fulfilling this promise. But then during the period of the history of the kings, they disobeyed God's law. They began living and doing things their own way, just following the natural tendency of our humanity. And they were punished for that and sent under the rule and reign of the Babylonian people. So for hundreds of years, they were under Babylonian rule. And then that's when God freed them from that, allowed them to come back, and Ezra and Nehemiah were written. These are 2 actual characters, historical men that lived, and there's a 3rd character that's a part of this story as well. But in regards to the authorship of the Ezra-Nehemiah narrative, most theological scholars agree that it was primarily written by Ezra. He was known as a scribe. That was his job, so to speak. That was what he did. He recorded history. So Ezra likely wrote both of those books, and that's why it was just one manuscript, one narrative. But there is some first-person narrative from Nehemiah that's at the end of the whole piece, and that's kind of how the break came between the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But Ezra is the primary author for both of them. So that takes us to those 2 books, and what we can learn from those two books about God giving direction for His people. There are 2 purposes in the writing of these books. The first is that these two, the Ezra and Nehemiah narrative, fulfill the promise that was recorded in Jeremiah, where God promised that He would allow the exiles to one day return to Jerusalem. And that story is recorded in Jeremiah 25. So the prophet Jeremiah, again a contemporary of the history that was going on during this period, writes that God will allow you to return. You have been exiled from your homeland for years, but God is going to bring you back to your home. And so that was one of the reasons that the narrative was written, to record the fact that God fulfilled that promise and did bring them back. Secondly, it points out that the Israelite people had strayed so far from the commands of God, from the promises of God, that they needed a new heart. And now that's not a literal interpretation. They didn't actually need to have a heart transplant. They didn't need a live heart put back in their chest cavity. They needed a metaphorical new heart. They needed a symbolic new heart. And that was because they had wandered, they had strayed, they had pretty much trusted their own way and done things their own way. And in Jeremiah 31 and in Ezekiel 36, both of those prophets record this idea that man's heart is deceitful above all. It is wicked. Who can know it? And that God promised to give them a new heart, a heart of flesh and not a heart of stone, because their hearts had gotten so hard to the commands of God. So that's the purpose that this narrative was written. And that helps us understand who wrote it, why it was written, where it falls in the history of the flow of the Old Testament, and leads us to the three significant events that are included in this narrative. So three events that happen in the Ezra and Nehemiah narrative that we're going to identify and then make application of. The first event was when the temple was rebuilt. And that was led by a leader, the Israelite leader, whose name was Zerubbabel. That's just a fun name to say, don't you think? Mm-hmm. Zerubbabel. He was the leader under the king of Persia, who was had influence in the land where Jerusalem was. And he led the people in rebuilding the temple. So they'd been exiled to Babylon, hundreds of years away from their homeland, and when they returned, what did they find? Everything was in shambles. The place where they worshipped was knocked down, torn down, uncared for. Kind of like old homes or barns that you see out in the country when you're driving along and nobody's lived in them for years. Nobody's used them, nobody's kept them up. They just, through being weathered and during storms, they just, start to degrade. And that's what they found when they got back and saw their temple. The wall that had been built around the city of Jerusalem was in disrepair. It was completely destroyed and just open to whatever enemy they had to be able to come in and impact them, to loot their things or cause them any kind of trouble. So the first thing that happens in this story is that they come and rebuild the temple. And it's important that this is the first thing, because the significance of rebuilding the temple was it established worship in the life of God's people. It established the most important thing that God's people can do is to worship God. And so for the Israelites of that day, under the leadership of Zerubbabel, they rebuilt the temple, because before they could do anything else to their homeland, they had to have a place to worship. That's what God was calling them to, because they were in a covenant relationship with God. And so they needed a place to worship, and Zerubbabel led that charge. The second event that occurred was led by Ezra. Already mentioned, he was known as a scribe, and the event that he headed up was the rebuilding of the Jewish community. So they've been scattered abroad. They've been scattered all over the place. And they're being allowed and being sent back to their homeland that's in disrepair, some of them didn't really want to go because it's like, I don't want to live here. This place is a mess. But Ezra led the reestablishment of the Jewish community. And what that signified for them was a cohesive unit of people that had a national identity. So they had been identified as God's people from the very beginning when God called Abraham. And then they've been scattered abroad, brought back together, and now they needed to reestablish that national identity. After some of these events occurred, then the nation of Israel was disbanded again. And many of you may know, the last time that it was reconstituted and reestablished as a nation was in 1948. So this is the 50-year anniversary of Israel being reestablished as a nation and identified by the United Nations as a legitimate country. And Ezra was the leader at this time whenever it was being rebuilt. And so what it did, what Ezra focused on during that time period of rebuilding the Jewish community was the centrality of God's Word, that they follow the commands of God. That's what they needed to do in order to know who they were and to have that identity as God's people. The third event that occurred in this historical narrative is when the wall was rebuilt. And that was led by Nehemiah. He was identified as the cupbearer to the king of Persia. So Zerubbabel was under the authority of the king of Persia in the very beginning, and then Ezra was a scribe, and Nehemiah was also connected to the king of Persia, who was a different king at that time, and he was his cupbearer. So that's like being the right-hand man to the king. And what rebuilding the wall signified was it provided security against their enemies. So when Nehemiah led them in rebuilding the wall, it was securing them against any outside forces, anything that might come and, or anybody that might come and attack them, steal their things, take their women and children, kill them, take them captive again. And this was significant because the Israelites had been scattered around. They were not a cohesive unit, and they didn't identify as a people until they came back to Jerusalem. And when they came back, all of the neighboring countries were like, who are you? And who do you think you are? And they developed some enemies very quickly. And they were a threat to the peoples that were living in that geographic part of the world. And they also, those peoples that lived there, worshipped foreign gods and pagan gods. And the Israelites were a threat to them because of the way they worshiped. The Israelites worshiped very differently and worshiped a different God and claimed that he was the only God. And so that set up a division and a contention between Israel, or the people of Jerusalem, and all of their neighboring, all their neighbors, which turned out to be all their enemies. So these three events occurred in this historical narrative. And the significance of them is the first event, rebuilding the temple, established worship. The second event, rebuilding the community, focused them on following God's commands and God's law and making them a united people. And the third event, rebuilding the wall, provided them a sense of security in a hostile environment. So we want to look at how these three events and this historical, biblical history applies to us. How can we take what we've just talked about and make application to our own context right now? It's important to understand that while this is actual history, the events did occur, we have records of these events occurring, of these people really actually living. The narrative that's written was not written to us. It was written to a specific group of people. It was written for a specific time period. It wasn't written with the thought that in 2018 there's going to be followers of God who need to follow this these commands, need to act in this specific way. So the Christian scriptures are loaded with lots of examples where commands are given and instruction is given. But it's always given in the context of the people that the scriptures were written to. So for us, none of that is written to us today in the year 2018. But we can take the principles that are contained within those commands and in those instructions and apply it to our context. And that's what I want us to do. So while none of this is written directly to us, we can benefit from it because we can take the principles and apply them to our own context. And there's two levels that I want us to address in making those applications. I want us to talk about it from an institutional perspective as a educational campus, and then on a personal level. Each one of us, what can we do to take the principles from these three events and use them in our own lives in order to help build spiritual structures. And that's why the title of this in-service is that, Building Spiritual Structures. Each one of those events in the Ezra-Nehemiah narrative reflects a building project. It reflects some hard work, manual labor. And there were elements of planning, intentionality, the gathering of resources, organizing plans, organizing people. When I think about all of those elements that were a part of those three events, it sounds a lot like what we do here at Baptist Health College Little Rock. We do a lot of planning. We do a lot of organizing. We have to be very intentional about the things that we do. And we have to draw upon the resources that we have at our disposal. While we are in no way intended to replace the element of worship that God calls for His people, as an institution, we are a place that can reflect the principles of that command to worship God. So I don't want to be misunderstood to make you think we should start doing things like a church does. That this, when we come to work, is like going to church every day. Because that is not the case. We are an educational institution. We were not designed to be a church and to meet the needs and commands that God has given His people. That is something totally separate and different. However, as an educational institution, we are influenced by those principles that apply in the lives of God's people outside of the church. So we're not, as an institution, going to ever take the place of a church or become a church. But we can act in ways that are reflective of what God calls His people to as a part of the bigger church, the body of Christ. So let's look at each one of these events again and talk about some application that we can do. The first is the rebuilding of the temple and the fact that when the temple was rebuilt, that reestablished worship. How we can apply that as an institution, how we can apply that to ourselves here is for us to become more aware of the spiritual needs and the spiritual activity that's going on in the lives of our students. So generally speaking, we're not going to reestablish worship here in this building for God's people. We're not going to say everybody that applies and is accepted to Baptist Health College Little Rock has got to be a Christian, and you've got to go to chapel, and you've got to worship in this kind of way. That is not what we're going to do. But the principle that we can draw from that event in Ezra-Nehemiah is we need to be aware of the spiritual activity that's going on in our students' lives and the fact that they have spiritual needs. We all have spiritual needs when we come to work each day. And our students have spiritual needs. We just need to be more aware of what those needs are and take advantage of the opportunities when spiritual activity presents itself. So let's look at the institutional things that we do or can do to help meet this need. First is student chapel. We've been doing that about 8 years now, 3 times a semester. We pause, we take an educational break, And everyone that is on campus is welcomed and invited to come and attend a time where we focus our attention on God, we worship, we sing, we sometimes hear a message, sometimes a devotional. But it's a time where we take a break from the purpose of our institution to educate and learn, and we focus on the fact that we all have spiritual needs. So Student Chapel is one of the ways that we reflect this need for worship, and we give that opportunity to students. So the fact that you attend or that you support it, you let your students out to come and be a part of it, you are helping to build a spiritual structure on our campus. And that gives our students support to feel like, hey, this is an important aspect of my educational experience, having a spiritual expression and having a place to do that. Another place where we are currently demonstrating this need, spiritual need that students have, is in the classroom. And that occurs usually on test days. So before an exam happens, I think lots of faculty will offer to pray, or they ask if a student in class would like to pray. And they will offer prayer before a group test occurs. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because we all know those are very stressful days. Students' anxiety is extremely high. But I want to suggest that maybe instead of just praying on test days, we begin praying in class a little more frequently. Pray on days that you don't have a test. Pray on days when there's something else going on. Or maybe the content could be a difficult content to present. But take the opportunity to not just pray on test days, but to pray before your classes when those needs arise. And you'll know when that time occurs. You'll know when that's appropriate to do. So those are two things that, as an institution, we're doing and can continue and will continue to do to help build spiritual structures. Let's talk about a personal level. How can we be more spiritually aware and take advantage of spiritual activity in students' lives? Well, there's 3 levels, and this is where y'all pick which level that you fall in, because I want to share some examples that I think fit, whether you're in academic advising, whether you're in student services, whether you're an instructor in the classroom, or even an administrator. Whatever role you play on this campus, you can be more aware of spiritual needs in students' lives, and maybe even take advantage of some of those opportunities. So for example, let's say you're an instructor and you've got a student in your office, and you're talking to them about their grade, and they're right there on the bubble, and maybe they can make it, mathematically they can make it, but it's going to take a lot of work on their part. And the student says something like, well, I've really been praying that I'm going to pass this course. That's an invitation for you to respond in kind. That's a spiritual opportunity. When a student introduces any element of faith like that, that's an opportunity, an open door for you to respond in kind to them and to interject your own sense of spirituality. And it doesn't have to be something that is uncomfortable for you, but responding in such a way where you acknowledge the fact that, okay, they have mentioned a higher power, they have mentioned the concept of God, they have mentioned something about faith. So you respond to them by saying something like, you know, that's a really good idea, because prayer does make a difference. Just a very simple statement. You affirm what they have said. You have affirmed, you have spiritual needs. And this was a spiritual moment. You said something about your belief that prayer could affect your outcome, and I'm just affirming that, yes, prayer does make a difference. And what you're communicating is, I believe in prayer too, and that will help you, so keep it up. If you're in student services, the same kind of thing might happen, might present itself. A student says, you know, I'm just really praying that I'll get in. You know, it's the kind of situation where you are communicating with the student very regularly, very frequently, and they're anxious and they're stressed and they really want to get that acceptance. And they finally say something like, you know, I'm just praying that I'll get in here. Well, that's an opportunity to say, you know, that's a good idea, because prayer does make a difference. And you affirm them when you do that. If you're in front of the students in a lecturing context, or maybe in a clinical setting, that is a wonderful opportunity to incorporate the spiritual aspect of care that we want to teach our students. So our philosophy is that when our students leave, they understand holistic care, all aspects of the patient, not just the physical symptoms. And depending on what the context or the content of your lecture is, or what you're trying to illustrate in the clinical setting, there may be the chance for you to interject something like, if you ever hear a patient say, "I'm just praying the Lord is going to get me through this." Patients say that kind of thing a lot. I've heard that many times in my interactions with patients, especially in my role as a chaplain. And if a patient ever mentions anything about, "I'm praying this," or I'm asking God for this," or "I just hope the Lord will get me through," that's an opportunity. That's an invitation, again, for you to affirm this is a spiritual moment. This is an opportunity for us to say, "That's right." Or if you're comfortable, offering to pray with them and encouraging your students to do that. Saying to them, if you ever hear your patients say this kind of thing, those are opportunities. If you're comfortable, respond to them in an appropriate way. Simply pat them on the shoulder, squeeze their hand, offer to pray with them, affirm them verbally. You know, do those very simple things. That builds spiritual structures for our students, that encourages elements of worship. So as an institution, we can learn from that event in Nehemiah. We're doing it in a couple of different ways, and we could probably add more. As individuals, regardless of what your role is, there are opportunities for you to take advantage of an open door that a student or a patient might give in regards to supporting them spiritually. The second event that we identified was the rebuilding of the Jewish community. And the significance or the importance of that event is that it reestablished a national identity for the Israelite people, for God's people. And the application for us globally as an institution and as individuals is the importance of belonging. The fact that Ezra led a charge to reunite and reestablish a national identity for God's people was an attempt to meet that need of belonging that we all have, to be a part of a family, to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, to connect with others of like mind or like spirit. So belonging is a need that we all have. It's actually one of our universal spiritual needs. To feel loved and to feel like we belong gives us safety and security. And so what we can do here on our campus is nurture that sense of belonging by creating a sense of campus identity. So institutionally, there are things that we are doing and some things that maybe we can do to support this. One of the things that we're doing, and this is relatively new, are our t-shirt sales and how we have expanded that to allow different programs to create designs and sell t-shirts campus-wide. In doing this, we are identifying ourselves as members of the college, as members of Baptist Health College Little Rock. Not just, here's a t-shirt for the radiography students, here's a t-shirt for nursing students, here's a t-shirt for the histo students. We've got t-shirts that reflect our campus. And that makes them feel like they are attached and connected to a body of people, a group of people. So there's that sense of belonging that's met. I love the fact that we're doing that. And one of the t-shirts that I really appreciated the most, it was the first one that I noticed this happening in a really sending a strong message, came from the OTA program. And it's the t-shirt that on the back, it has puzzle pieces that are connected together, and it's basically all of our programs, and we fit together like pieces of a puzzle, and we make a whole. So while we are 9 unique programs, we are one institution. And that t-shirt from the OTA program, I think, expressed that so well. And I've seen other t-shirts kind of follow suit and communicate that we're a campus. We're not just nursing at Baptist Health College or nuclear medicine at Baptist Health College. We are Baptist Health College Little Rock. A second thing that, or a second way that we can apply this principle is to remind our students that the profession they're going into is a noble calling. That not everybody can work in healthcare. It really is not the kind of thing that is fit for just anybody or everybody. Healthcare, working in the helping professions, is a calling. And reminding students and ourselves that we are a part of a community of people that really are called to what we do. We're not doing it for the money. We're not doing it for the prestige. We're not doing it to climb the ladder. You all in this room, our students who have come to our campus, they're here because they want to help people. I've heard that over and over and over again from students. I came to nursing school because I want to help people. I want to care for people. That's what we do, and that sets us apart from other professions. So that gives us a sense of belonging. I'm a part of the healthcare team in whatever role that you play, and that is a noble calling. And then the third way that we can apply this is by encouraging camaraderie between our programs. 9 unique programs on our campus, but we don't have to be at odds with one another. We can enjoy each other, enjoy the different aspects of other professions. So generally, we've got nursing, that's our RN and PN programs, and allied health. And that includes the 7 allied health programs. Those should not be pitted against each other. We should not be at odds with each other. We should have a fellowship, a camaraderie, where we respect and value what each other presents and brings to the table. And us communicating that to our students and amongst ourselves can build this sense of belonging and help us feel more like, we are an institution. We are a unit. And this is the role that I play, and this is who I am and how I identify, but I'm a part of something bigger. I'm a part of Baptist Health College Little Rock. Again, on a personal level, we're going to look at this, give some examples that include academic advising, student services, and in the classroom in an instructor kind of role. Helping to establish that sense of belonging for our students. We can do that one-on-one pretty easily. And I encourage you, when you have that opportunity, use simple examples and illustrations from your own life and your own experience. I want to call out 2 people, and it's always dangerous when you start naming people's names, but these 2 people I work with pretty regularly and their students pretty regularly. And so I know and hear them talking to their students and the things that they say, and I'm a part of that with them. But these 2 people, there's one from our nursing program, Sue Manning, and then from our allied health program, Jeannie Manise. Both of them go out of their way to communicate to their students that the field that their students are in is a noble profession, that they are called to what they're doing. Sue Manning tells her students every semester for the last 18 or 20 years, nurses are identified as the most respected profession, except for the year 2001 when 9/11 occurred, and that's when the firemen got it. But otherwise, nurses are always identified as the most respected profession by people. And Jeannie Manise makes sure that her students know working in the lab is a significant role on the healthcare team. What you do, the results that you are delivering to doctors impacts people's lives. You may not have direct patient care, but what you do is important, and it impacts the doctors, the nurses, and the rest of the team as they deliver sometimes very unfortunate information to patients. So doing that kind of thing and reminding our students, this is a calling, and what you're doing, you're a part of a group that not everybody can be a part of. It's not a y'all come. It is a special calling that we have. We can also, if you're in student services, buy our campus t-shirts and wear them on Fridays. Because Fridays are T-shirt day. So when you're here on campus, wear those T-shirts that our students are selling and demonstrate your belonging to the campus and help communicate that. When you hear people talk about our campus, even though it's been 3 years now that we have changed our names to Baptist Health College Little Rock, I still hear people say, the School of Nursing. Oh, you're at the School of Nursing. What I want to encourage you to do is to just gently correct people. Because for us to have an identity as Baptist Health College, we all have to do that. We all have to play a part of helping people understand, well, we refer to ourselves as the college, or we're Baptist Health College now. We're not just the School of Nursing. And you don't have to say we're not just the School of Nursing. You just say we like to call ourselves Baptist Health College, or that's our new name. And correct that so that the identity of the whole is what's communicated. And do it gently. You know, sometimes people just don't know. Yes, it was printed in the connection. Yes, we had a big ceremony, but people just don't always get the information. So just gently remind them, we're Baptist Health College. And then probably the most important thing that we can do on a personal level, whether you answer the phone at the receptionist desk or you talk to potential students, applicants, and try to recruit them to our campus, or you are actually in front of them one-on-one, either in the classroom, you're in front of them in the classroom, or you're one-on-one in your office, or you've got them in a small group of clinical, is to remind ourselves that we are a campus. We're an institution comprised of 9 different programs, and not pit ourselves against each other. It's a tension that we deal with, and it's very reflective of the same kind of tension that occurs in most businesses where there's a sales department and a service department. Sales always thinks that they're the best because they're the ones that bring in the money. And the service department thinks you can't do it without me. And both of those are true. You have to have a sales department in order for the business to be profitable. But you have to have a service department to have repeat business in order for the business to be profitable. We have to have our nursing program. That's our largest group of students. That's where we really have the greatest revenue. But our allied health programs are just as significant and just as important. And the roles that those students play when they graduate are integral across our hospital campuses. So we just got to remind ourselves of that. You know, I'm not just part of the allied health group. I'm not just part of nursing. I'm part of Baptist Health College. All right, that brings us to the last event and application for us to make. And that has to do with the rebuilding of the wall that was led by Nehemiah. And what it did was provided them security. We here at Baptist Health College have a duty and an obligation to keep our students safe when they're on our campus or under our purview. So this can be done physically and emotionally. And as an institution, we address those needs physically, those needs for safety and security physically. That comes in these 3 categories. We have external threats, we have internal threats, and then we have to deal with safety measures when our students are in clinicals. Externally, things that we've done to try to keep our students safe is we have secure access on all of our entrances around this building. So you can't get in the building unless you have a badge or unless somebody buzzes you in. And that's a way for us to keep our students safe. We have active shooter training. We teach our students that in the event that something unfortunate like that happens, here's how you can protect yourselves. We don't know what the future holds, but as an educational institution, we have to be prepared for those kind of things because it's occurring all over our country, and we can't just turn a blind eye to that. We have to be prepared. Another thing that we do is everybody has a campus-issued ID. You have to have on some kind of identification that says you belong in this building. And so that's another way that we keep people safe. And we do background checks like nobody's business. So before a student is ever finally admitted and accepted, I mean fully and completely, they have had all kinds of background checks and things in their past that have been evaluated and looked at to make sure that they qualify and meet all the criteria that is necessary. The threats from within, we do things to try to help our students as they interact with each other. We provide suicide awareness at orientations. We send out information about being a discrimination-free campus, and we really try to behave in a way that demonstrates equality and respect for everyone. We do not tolerate bullying. That comes from our institution, from our connection with Baptist Health Medical Center Little Rock, but Baptist Health in general. We're not a place that's going to tolerate students bullying one another, faculty bullying students, or students bullying faculty. We're not going to tolerate that. And then we do what we can to ensure that the clinical sites that we use keep our students safe while they're there. So personally, this is where we can provide emotional safety for our students. And again, these are the three categories where these examples, you see how they fit for your own life. But one of the things we can do to provide students with emotional safety is just to recognize when they're having strong emotions. If you're in an academic advising situation, you've got a student in your office, and again, they're on the bubble or they're not passing, and it may not be mathematically possible for them to pass, they are likely to express some strong emotion. If you're in student services and they are they've been rejected again, they're not getting all their paperwork in, they're frustrated because you keep asking for stuff and they have to keep coming back up here to campus, they may likely express some strong emotions. They may cry, they may get angry, they may raise their voice. All of that is rooted in they don't feel emotionally safe. And when those kind of situations occur, the best thing we can do is simply acknowledge that they're occurring and then try to respond appropriately. So if you're in your office with a student and they begin to cry, or you're in student services and you've got somebody who's really angry, just acknowledge, I can tell you're upset. I'm sorry for that. If you're a faculty member, let me take off my faculty hat for just a minute and let's just talk. Tell me what's going on. In student services, you may not be able to use that metaphor, but you can say, hey, I can tell that something, you're troubled by something. What can I do to help you right now? What can I do to resolve this for you right now? It's not an easy situation to be in, but we need to make ourselves accessible and get on their level. For faculty, I understand it's very difficult because there is a professional boundary that has to be maintained. And you'll know when you've gotten closer, starting to cross over that boundary. But what I'm suggesting is just really simply acknowledging when those strong emotions are expressed in order to try to resolve them quickly or de-escalate them as quickly as you can. If it doesn't de-escalate, if they get even more angry, then you have to put your hat back on and take the appropriate measures. Refer them to me, call security, whatever is appropriate. You have to do those things whenever that boundary, that you've bumped up against that boundary of what is a professional relationship between you and a student. But when you can, acknowledge that strong emotion and just identify with them and hopefully help to de-escalate whatever they're feeling. Another thing that we can do, which is really simple and quite powerful, is just to simply give them a blessing as they leave our company or as you conclude a telephone conversation. This happens to you all the time. People do it all the time. And that is to say, have a blessed day. That statement, we hear it a lot, but we don't really know what it means. But when you tell somebody at their parting company, you're hanging up with them on the phone, have a blessed day, what you are essentially saying is, may the riches of God's blessings pour upon you as you leave my company. May you experience all of His goodness, all of His grace, all of His mercy, everything that God can give you as you leave. That's a blessing. And it is expressed in very simple words. Have a blessed day. But that's really what it means, is that as you leave my company, I hope God will continue to bless you in ways that you can't even ask, imagine, or think. And that's a simple thing that we can add to our conversation, especially if you feel comfortable doing that. And then lastly is the Chick-fil-A model. Y'all know that. You know, I started going to Chick-fil-A because I like it, but I keep going because they say, it's my pleasure. Whatever I ask of them, they say, it's my pleasure. And when you go to the same Chick-fil-A on a regular basis, they know you, and they know you by name. And they come by and they greet you and they talk to you. And they give you coupons for free food. I mean, you go to this place and I've established a relationship with the Chick-fil-A on Markham in front of the Home Depot. They know me there. And it's all because they look me in the eye, they smile, they say please, they say thank you. And that model has been so powerful that all kinds of other fast food and other restaurants are doing the very same thing. You can't walk into McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's or any place and them not say, welcome to McDonald's, welcome to Burger King. Because it worked for Chick-fil-A, and so they're doing it all over the place. Well, if it's working there, it can work here too. So, I mean, simply helping students feel emotionally safe is to look them in the eye and say, hello, nice to meet you, or thank you for coming in. Just being pleasant, having what we would call, what our grandmothers would call good manners. So those are some things that establish emotional security and build strong spiritual structures in our lives and in our community here at Baptist Health College. Well, there's 3 significant events that we've talked about. And we've pulled principles from each one of these events to apply to our own context and how we can make students be more aware of their spiritual needs and their need to belong, and also their need for safety and security. So when we talked about Zerubbabel leading the charge to rebuild the temple, that tells us we need to focus on the spiritual needs of our students. We need to make ourselves a little more conscious and a little more aware. And if you make one minor adjustment, it will have a ripple effect that will help way down the road. When the Jews rebuilt their community and Ezra led them in that, it created a sense of identity and unity. And that's what we really need to do here on our campus, to get our students to feeling like they are a part of a community. And then when they rebuilt the wall under Nehemiah's leadership, it provided them physical and emotional safety, which is essential here for us, especially at this time in modern culture and history. Well, after these 3 events occurred in Ezra Nehemiah's time, when that manuscript was written, things didn't automatically get better for the Jewish people. The Israelites didn't experience a quick fix. That time period, those 3 events that occurred from Zerubbabel to Ezra to Nehemiah was about 15 years. And when you look at the expanse of history from the beginning of time until now, 15 years is a blip. I mean, you can't hardly even mark it on a scale. But in that short period of time, things turned around for them. But it wasn't a quick fix, and it didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't a magic pill that God gave them to turn everything around and make it work. What made the difference for them was their day-to-day obedience as the people of God to the commands of God. They messed up, they regressed, they fell back, but they always came back to following God's commands and being obedient because they were God's people. That is what will make the difference here on our campus at Baptist Health College. Day to day, doing the right thing, doing what we know is the best thing, that's what will make the difference in our own personal lives and experience. And that will ripple out to our students and make a difference to them. And they'll feel like that they are a part of a place that values spirituality, that models spirituality, not only teaches it, but models it, and that gives them what they need to be successful and to understand and experience holistic care as they learn how to take care of patients. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you might have or comments.
I really like how you pulled all of this together and gave us
so many ways that we can work with our students.
Good, thank you.
They have all of this going on with them.
Thank
I
you.
mean, sometimes there's just a steady stream.
And this time of the semester, the stream is very steady.
I think another way too that you provide the spiritual care of people, of our students, is require them to have community services to help the Christians in a Christian-like attitude.
Yeah.
Start our community.
Yes. That is another way that supports that. Serving others is a element of worship.
And we have to.
Yes. And it just goes right along with the profession and calling that we have.
I think it really speaks to the fact of our values. So, absolutely, I enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I appreciate all of you being here. If you've got any questions you want to ask me individually, I'm happy to entertain those. But I wish you a blessed day as you go forward.
And just leave your evaluations at the front there, just please.